A well-dressed stranger appeared at a coal miner's cabin in West Virginia, claiming to be the biological mother of their 6-year-old daughter. She carried hospital records proving the child they had raised was stolen at birth by the most trusted woman in 3 counties, a midwife who had turned poverty into profit. Before we dive into the story, make sure you subscribe to the channel because we're uncovering stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. Stories that need to be told. Also, kindly drop a comment telling us your location and what you're doing right now. I love connecting with our global community. Now, let's continue with the story. Snow fell heavy on the morning of February 12, 1947, when Margaret Hensley knocked on the door of the Vance family cabin in the coal mining hollows of southern West Virginia. The woman who answered, Ruth Vance, saw a stranger in a wool coat, far too fine for these mountains. Her hands clutched around a leather folder that seemed to hold something precious or damning. Margaret's voice shook as she spoke the words that would shatter 2 families and expose a decade of calculated theft, hidden behind the trusted face of mercy. She was looking for her daughter, the child she had given birth to on April 9, 1941, in a Cincinnati hospital. The baby girl, midwife Beatrice Lell had told her died 3 hours after delivery due to complications Margaret's poor health had caused. Margaret had carried that guilt for 6 years, believing her weakness had killed her firstborn, until a chance encounter with an old medical student who had been present at the birth told her a different truth. The baby had been healthy, crying perfect. There had been no complications, no death, no reason for the grief that had poisoned Margaret's life. Ruth Vance stood frozen in the doorway, her face draining of color as Margaret opened the folder. Inside were hospital records, a birth certificate listing Margaret as mother, nursing notes describing a healthy infant girl, and a photograph of Margaret taken while pregnant that matched the timeline exactly. Ruth's own daughter, the girl she had named Emily and raised as her own for 6 years, was playing in the back room, unaware that her entire existence was about to be questioned by a woman carrying proof of an impossible crime. The Vances had obtained Emily through Beatrice Lell in April 1941, just weeks after Margaret's delivery in Cincinnati. The midwife had brought the infant to their cabin, explaining that an unwed mother had died during childbirth and the baby needed a home. Ruth, who had suffered 3 miscarriages and believed she could never carry a child to term, had seen the offer as a blessing from God. They paid Beatrice $300, everything they had saved from 2 years of mining wages, and received documents stating they were Emily's legal adoptive parents. But Margaret's hospital records told a different story. Her baby had been born alive, had been taken from her room while she slept, and had disappeared from Cincinnati the same night. Someone had falsified a death certificate. Someone had stolen a healthy newborn from a grieving mother. And someone had sold that child to a desperate couple 4 hours away in the West Virginia mountains. That someone was Beatrice Lell, and Margaret had come to take back what had been stolen. Within 48 hours, 2 more mothers appeared in the county, both carrying documentation that contradicted Beatrice's records, both demanding the children they had mourned for years. Beatrice, Lell's house, sat at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud every spring, a modest structure that had witnessed the first breaths of over 400 babies in 12 years. The front room served as her clinic, with a delivery table covered in oilcloth, shelves lined with medical supplies, and a wood stove that kept the space warm during mountain winters. Women throughout the hollows spoke her name with reverence, crediting her with saving mothers and babies that hospitals would have turned away for lack of payment. She had arrived in southern West Virginia in 1935, a widow in her early 40s, with nursing experience and a compassionate manner that put frightened mothers at ease. The coal mining communities desperately needed someone like her. The nearest hospital was in Charleston, 40 miles over treacherous mountain roads that became impassable in winter, and most mining families could not afford the fees hospitals charged. Beatrice charged $5 for a delivery, sometimes accepting payment in food or labor, and she never refused a case, no matter how difficult or dangerous. Her reputation grew through word of mouth. She had delivered breech babies that other midwives said were impossible. She had saved women hemorrhaging after childbirth, when death seemed certain. She had sat with laboring mothers for 20 hours straight, refusing to leave until both mother and child were safe. The communities she served were scattered across 3 counties, isolated cabins connected by footpaths and logging roads, places where neighbors lived miles apart, and everyone knew everyone else's business. But Beatrice's careful attention to these communities served a purpose beyond mercy. She tracked every pregnancy with meticulous detail, visiting expectant mothers monthly, throughout their terms, asking questions that seemed routine but gathered crucial information. She learned which families were struggling financially, which women faced shame for pregnancies outside marriage, which husbands were abusive or absent, which mothers already had more children than they could feed. She documented everything in a journal she kept locked in her bedroom, noting due dates, family circumstances, and observations about each woman's vulnerability. The isolated nature of her territory made her record, keeping the only official documentation for most births. County offices rarely received reports from the hollows, and few families bothered with formal birth certificates when babies were born at home. Beatrice became the sole authority on who was born, who died, and what happened in the crucial hours between a child's first breath and its entry into the world. That authority gave her power that extended far beyond medicine. She targeted specific types of women with practiced precision. Unwed mothers were her primary source. Girls as young as 15 who faced complete social ostracism if they kept babies born outside marriage. Beatrice would arrive for these deliveries with sympathy and practical solutions, suggesting adoption as the merciful choice that would give the child opportunities the mother could never provide. She never pushed immediately, instead planting seeds during prenatal visits, letting shame and fear do most of the work. Destitute families with multiple children presented different opportunities. Beatrice would comment casually about how hard it must be to feed another mouth, how the baby might have better chances elsewhere, how some families she knew were desperate for children and would treat the infant like royalty. for widows left alone. After mining accidents, she emphasized the impossibility of single motherhood in poverty. The cruelty of keeping a child who would only know hunger and hardship. Her methods were so subtle that most women believed the ideas were their own. That surrendering their babies was a choice born of love, rather than manipulation crafted over months of calculated erosion. The first theft happened on a November night in 1936, when Beatrice delivered a baby boy to 17-year-old Sarah Crenshaw in a one-room cabin that reeked of desperation. The girl's family had thrown her out when her pregnancy became visible, and she had been living alone on the charity of neighbors who left food on her doorstep but refused to speak to her directly. Sarah had no husband, no money, and no plan beyond surviving the delivery. Beatrice arrived at dusk, as the contractions intensified, carrying her medical bag and a manner so gentle that Sarah wept with gratitude. The labor lasted 6 hours, and when the baby finally came, he was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a lusty cry that filled the cabin with proof of life. But Sarah did not reach for him. She turned her face to the wall, her body shaking with sobs that had nothing to do with physical pain. Beatrice wrapped the infant in a clean blanket and placed him in a basket near the stove. She sat by Sarah's bed and spoke in low, soothing tones about the impossibility of the situation. How could Sarah feed a baby when she could barely feed herself? Where would they live when winter came and the cabin's roof leaked? What man would ever marry a girl with a bastard child? The questions were not cruel, but practical, each one reinforcing the trap Sarah already knew she was in. When Sarah finally whispered that she could not keep the baby, Beatrice had her answer ready. She knew a family, good people, who had been trying for years to have a child. They would give the boy everything Sarah could not: a real home, food, education, a future. All Sarah had to do was let Beatrice handle the arrangements. The girl could rest, heal, and try to rebuild a life that might still hold some possibility of redemption. Sarah signed papers she could barely read through her tears. Beatrice told her the baby needed immediate medical attention at a hospital. A small complication with his breathing that required specialized care. She would take him to Charleston that very night, get him treated, and deliver him to the waiting family. Sarah would receive updates about how he was doing. Reassurance that she had made the right choice. Beatrice left the cabin with the baby at midnight. But she did not drive to Charleston. She drove 3 hours in the opposite direction, to a town near the Ohio border, where a childless couple named the Hutchinsons had been waiting for months after answering Beatrice's discreet advertisement in a church bulletin. They had tried for 8 years to conceive, endured 2 stillbirths, and exhausted their options with legitimate adoption agencies that had years-long waiting lists. When Beatrice arrived at their door with a newborn boy, they asked no difficult questions. She told them the mother was an unwed girl who wanted a better life for her child, that everything was legal and proper, that the $800 they paid covered medical expenses and legal fees. She handed them a birth certificate she had forged that listed them as the biological parents. Birth date, November 7th, 1936. Delivered at home by midwife Beatrice Lell. The Hutchinsons named the boy Thomas and loved him as their own. 3 days later, Beatrice returned to Sarah's cabin with news that broke what remained of the girl's heart. The baby had died at the hospital despite the doctor's best efforts. His breathing problems had been too severe, his tiny lungs too weak. Beatrice provided a death certificate, fabricated but official, looking enough to seem real, and told Sarah that the body had been cremated per hospital policy for infant deaths. Sarah Crenshaw spent the rest of her life believing she had killed her son through the sin of conceiving him. The success of that first theft gave Beatrice a blueprint she would refine over the next 11 years. She categorized every pregnant woman in her territory by vulnerability, creating a mental hierarchy of targets that guided her planning months before deliveries occurred. Unwed mothers remained her most reliable source. Girls desperate enough to believe any story that relieved them of an impossible burden. But Beatrice expanded her operation to include other categories of victims whose circumstances made them equally exploitable. Poor families with multiple children became frequent targets. Beatrice would attend deliveries for women already stretched beyond their capacity. Mothers who wept when they discovered another pregnancy because they could not imagine feeding another mouth. During these births, Beatrice would speak casually about families she knew who were desperate for babies. Wealthy people who would give a child advantages that poverty could never allow. She never demanded an immediate decision, but planted the idea early, letting it grow through months of prenatal visits until the mother convinced herself that surrender was an act of love. For the most resistant cases, Beatrice carried sedatives in her medical bag. Chloral hydrate dissolved easily in water and could make women drowsy and confused during the chaos of labor. A mother dosed with the drug might not clearly remember whether her baby had cried or not, whether it had moved or lay still, whether the blood on the sheets was normal or evidence of something catastrophic. Beatrice used these drugs sparingly but strategically, typically on women who might question her version of events, creating gaps in memory that made mothers doubt their own perceptions. The darkest opportunities came when mothers died during childbirth. A genuine risk in home deliveries where complications could turn fatal within minutes. Beatrice attended approximately 40 births each year, and in 12 years, she witnessed 11 maternal deaths from hemorrhage, infection, and eclampsia. In legitimate cases, she would deliver the baby, attempt to save the mother, and when efforts failed, notify the family and arrange for burial, while finding homes for the orphaned infants through county services. But in several cases where mothers died and their families were absent or unaware, Beatrice saw profitable opportunities. She would declare both mother and infant dead, file paperwork for the mother's burial, then sell the living baby to waiting buyers within hours. The families of the deceased mothers, already devastated by loss, rarely questioned the details when Beatrice told them the baby had died too. They buried their daughters or daughters-in-law and tried to move forward, never knowing that somewhere a stolen infant was being raised by strangers. Beatrice maintained 2 sets of records that told completely different stories. Her official documents, filed with county offices when she bothered to file them at all, showed a tragic pattern of infant mortality. 30. 2 babies declared dead over 12 years. Deaths attributed to stillbirth, breathing complications, congenital defects, and failure to thrive. Most mountain communities expected high infant mortality, so the numbers raised no immediate suspicion. Her private ledger, kept locked in a metal box, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, told the truth. Each entry listed a buyer's name, the amount paid, the date of transaction, and a brief description of the child. Boy, healthy, brown hair. Delivered April 3, 1939. Sold to Cunningham family, Charleston for $1,000. Girl, premature but viable, blonde. Delivered December 19, 1942. Sold to Landry family, Portsmouth, for $700. The ledger contained 27 confirmed transactions, with several more that appeared coded or incomplete, suggesting the true number might be higher. The prices varied based on the buyer's wealth and the child's perceived desirability. Healthy white infants commanded premium prices, sometimes $4,500, while babies born premature or with minor health issues sold for less. Beatrice built her buyer network through careful cultivation of desperate couples across 4 states. People who had exhausted legitimate adoption channels and were willing to pay substantial sum for healthy newborns with no legal complications. She advertised through coded messages placed in church bulletins and women's magazines. Phrases like private adoption services available and connecting families with blessings that signaled her true business to those searching for alternatives to years long agency waiting lists. Her buyers fell into 2 distinct categories. The first group genuinely believed they were participating in legal private adoptions. These couples, often middle-class professionals from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, had been told by adoption agencies that waits could stretch 5 to 7 years due to limited availability of white infants. When they found Beatrice through her advertisements, she presented herself as a compassionate facilitator who helped unwed mothers in Appalachia place babies with families who could provide better lives. She told them the fees they paid covered medical expenses, legal documentation, and her time coordinating the placements. These naive buyers received babies with what appeared to be legitimate paperwork. Beatrice forged birth certificates listing them as biological parents, created fake medical records documenting prenatal care and delivery details, and coached them on how to introduce suddenly appearing infants to neighbors and extended family. She advised them to claim they had been using a private doctor, or that the pregnancy had been kept secret due to previous miscarriages, or that they had been out of state for the birth. Most communities in the 1940s did not question such explanations, and few people demanded to see official documentation of births. The second category of buyers knew exactly what they were purchasing. These couples understood they were buying black market babies, children obtained through methods that would not withstand legal scrutiny, and they paid premium prices for that understanding. Beatrice charged them between $1,000 and $1,500 per infant, enormous sums when average annual income for working class families hovered around $2,000. These buyers wanted absolute assurance that no birth parents could ever surface to reclaim the children. And Beatrice provided that guarantee through her control of the original mothers. She cultivated relationships with buyers over months, sometimes years, before delivering babies to them. She would meet couples in neutral locations, typically hotels in cities between West Virginia and their home states, conducting interviews where she assessed their financial stability and their willingness to follow her instructions without asking dangerous questions. She rejected buyers who seemed likely to report her activities or who wanted too much information about the biological mothers. The ideal buyers were wealthy enough to pay her fees, desperate enough to overlook questionable circumstances, and smart enough to maintain the fiction that would protect everyone involved. Some buyers became repeat customers. The Hutchinsons, who had purchased the first baby in 1936, returned in 1941 for a second child. After their successful experience, Beatrice provided them with a baby girl taken from a widow who died during delivery, completing their family while pocketing another for $7,200. Other couples referred friends to her services, creating an expanding network of families built on stolen children. The geographic spread of her buyer network provided crucial protection. Babies born in West Virginia were sold to families in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and even as far as New York. The distances made it nearly impossible for biological mothers to accidentally encounter their stolen children, and the state borders complicated any potential legal investigations. Beatrice understood that isolation was her greatest ally. Keeping birth mothers separated from buyers by hundreds of miles and years of carefully constructed lies that both groups had powerful reasons to believe. Not every mother accepted the stories Beatrice told them about dead babies and merciful adoptions. Several women spent years haunted by details that refused to settle into the neat narratives they had been given. Inconsistencies that nagged at them during sleepless nights and quiet moments when grief overwhelmed reason. These mothers became searchers, women who refused to stop asking questions, even when their communities labeled them as unstable or unable to accept tragedy. Ida Sutton was one of them. In 1942, at age 19, she had given birth to a daughter with Beatrice's assistance in a remote cabin. Unmarried and terrified, Ida had initially agreed to let Beatrice arrange an adoption, believing the child would have opportunities poverty could never provide. But Beatrice had taken the baby that same night, promising regular updates about the girl's new family and well-being. Those updates never came. When Ida tried to contact Beatrice 6 months later, asking for any information about her daughter, the midwife told her that adoption records were sealed by law and no details could be shared. Something in Beatrice's response felt wrong to Ida. The woman's tone had shifted from compassionate to cold, her explanations too rehearsed, her refusal to provide even basic reassurance too absolute. Ida began writing letters to county offices, asking about adoption laws and procedures, trying to understand whether sealed records really meant total silence. Most officials ignored her inquiries or provided vague responses that led nowhere. But Ida kept writing, kept asking, kept pushing against a system designed to make women like her disappear. Another searcher was Helen Kowalski, a Polish immigrant whose English was limited but whose instincts were sharp. In 1944, Beatrice had delivered Helen's son in a difficult breech birth that lasted 14 hours. When it was finally over, Beatrice told Helen the baby had died due to complications, that his position during delivery had caused damage too severe for survival. But Helen had heard her son cry. She was certain of it. A sound that cut through her exhaustion and pain. A cry that proved life. When she asked to see the body, Beatrice refused, claiming the sight would traumatize her, and that the infant had already been taken to a funeral home for preparation. Helen never received a death certificate, despite requesting one multiple times. Beatrice told her the paperwork had been filed with the county. But when Helen went to the courthouse herself, struggling through the language barrier to make officials understand her question, no record existed. The clerk suggested the midwife had simply forgotten to file it. A common oversight in rural areas where official documentation was often neglected. But Helen knew the difference between forgotten paperwork and a missing child. A third woman, Dorothy Marsh, had given birth to twins in 1943. Beatrice told her that both babies were stillborn, delivered without breath or heartbeat after a labor complicated by Dorothy's poor health. But Dorothy remembered something that haunted her for years afterward. As Beatrice prepared to leave the cabin with the wrapped bundles she claimed contained dead infants, Dorothy had heard a small sound, barely more than a whimper, coming from one of the blankets. When she asked about it, Beatrice assured her it was just air escaping the body, a normal occurrence after death. The explanation satisfied Dorothy's husband, but it never satisfied her. These three women found each other through a church charity network in 1946. Ida had written to dozens of churches across West Virginia asking if anyone knew other mothers who had given up babies through Beatrice's arrangements. Helen responded first, then Dorothy, and when they compared their stories, the pattern became impossible to ignore. 3 different years, 3 different circumstances, but the same midwife, the same vague explanations, the same refusal to provide documentation or closure. When Margaret Hensley confronted the Vance family in February 1947, her arrival triggered a cascade of revelations that local authorities could no longer dismiss as coincidence or grief-induced delusion. Within 72 hours of that first confrontation, Ida Sutton, Helen Kowalski, and Dorothy Marsh descended on southern West Virginia, each carrying documentation that contradicted Beatrice's official records, each demanding investigations into children they had been told were dead or permanently beyond reach. Lawrence Finch, the county prosecutor, was 29 years old and new to his position, having won election just 4 months earlier on, promises to clean up corruption that had festered for decades. Unlike his predecessor, who had served for 18 years and cultivated relationships that prioritized loyalty over law, Finch had no allegiances to protect and no patience for the culture of looking away that allowed crimes to flourish in isolated communities. When 4 mothers appeared at his office within a single week, all telling variations of the same impossible story about Beatrice, he recognized something his predecessor would have buried. Finch began with the simplest verification. He pulled every death certificate Beatrice had filed over 12 years, 32 documents claiming infant deaths from various causes. Then he contacted funeral homes across 3 counties, asking for burial records that corresponded to those certificates. The responses revealed a pattern that was damning in its consistency. Only 11 of the 32 supposedly dead babies had actual burial records. 21 infants had simply vanished from all official documentation after Beatrice declared them dead. When Finch pressed funeral directors about the missing burials, their explanations collapsed under scrutiny. One claimed the families had requested private burials on their own land, a legal option, but one that still required documentation he could not produce. Another suggested cremations, but cremation services barely existed in rural West Virginia during the 1940s, and he had no records of ever performing such services for infants. A third funeral director, clearly uncomfortable with the questions, finally admitted he had signed cremation certificates for Beatrice without actually cremating any bodies, accepting 50D payments to provide paperwork that made deaths appear legitimate. Armed with this evidence, Finch obtained a search warrant for Beatrice's home. He arrived with 2 deputies on March 4, 1947. Finding the midwife at home and seemingly unconcerned by official attention, she invited them inside with a calmness that suggested either innocence or absolute confidence that nothing could touch her. That confidence shattered when deputies found the metal box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. The ledger inside documented 27 transactions in Beatrice's own handwriting. Each entry included a buyer's name, sometimes just a surname and city, an amount paid that ranged from $500 to $1,500. A date that corresponded with births Beatrice had attended, and brief physical descriptions of the babies. Boy, dark hair, delivered to Hutchinson family, November 1936. Girl, blonde, delivered to Landry family, December 1942. Twin boys delivered to separate families, April 1943. The entries matched several of the mothers' stories with devastating precision. Dorothy Marsh's twins, supposedly stillborn, appeared in the ledger as sold to 2 different families for a combined total of $1,800. Helen Kowalski's son, the baby she had heard cry before Beatrice claimed he was dead, was listed as delivered to a family in Maryland for $100,000. Ida Sutton's daughter, the adoption that was supposed to be sealed and untraceable, was recorded as sold to a couple in Ohio for $900. But the ledger also revealed something worse. Several entries had no corresponding mothers that investigators could identify, suggesting babies taken from women who had died during childbirth or who had been so isolated that their pregnancies and deliveries went completely unrecorded by anyone except Beatrice herself. The investigation expanded rapidly as Finch realized Beatrice had not operated alone. The scale of her operation required cooperation from multiple people in positions of authority. Individuals who had enabled her crimes through active participation or deliberate blindness. Within 2 weeks of finding the ledger, Finch had identified a network of complicity that extended throughout the county's official infrastructure. The county clerk, a man named Vernon Phelps, who had held his position for 15 years, had processed Beatrice's suspicious death certificates without ever questioning the pattern. Finch discovered that Phelps had accepted regular payments from Beatrice, $5 here, the $7 there, small amounts that added up to significant income over time. In exchange, Phelps expedited paperwork, asked no questions about inconsistencies, and never reported the alarming number of infant deaths to state health authorities, who might have investigated. When confronted with evidence of these payments, Phelps claimed he thought the money was simply tips for processing paperwork quickly. A common practice in rural county offices. But bank records showed deposits that corresponded precisely with dates when Beatrice filed death certificates for babies that had no burial records. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. A local doctor named Raymond Howell had provided medical cover for Beatrice's operation in ways that proved even more disturbing. Finch discovered that Howell had written prescriptions for chloral hydrate and other sedatives, far beyond what any legitimate medical practice would require. Medications Beatrice used to drug mothers during deliveries when she needed to create confusion about what had happened. Howell had also signed several death certificates for infants he had never examined, accepting Beatrice's word that the babies had died and providing official medical documentation that gave her false claims legitimacy. Howell's defense was that he had been helping an overworked midwife serve poor communities that had no other medical options. He claimed he had trusted Beatrice's professional judgment and had no reason to suspect criminal activity. But pharmacy records showed he had provided her with enough sedatives to dose dozens of women. Quantities that should have triggered suspicion about how the medications were being used. The most shocking discovery involved 3 prominent families in the county who had knowingly purchased babies from Beatrice and were now raising stolen children as their own. The Carmichael family, wealthy landowners who controlled much of the region's coal mining operations, had obtained a son from Beatrice in 1941 for $100,500. The Stroud family, who owned the largest general store in the county seat, had purchased a daughter in 1943 for $200,200. The Bellamy family, respected pillars of the local Methodist Church, had bought twin girls in 1945 for a combined price of $2,000. These families knew exactly what they had done. Correspondence seized from Beatrice's home included letters where buyers discussed the need for discretion, asked for assurances that biological mothers could never surface to reclaim the children, and negotiated prices based on the baby's physical characteristics. One letter from the Carmichael family explicitly stated they were willing to pay premium prices for a healthy white male infant with no traceable birth records. When Finch attempted to question these families, they immediately hired expensive lawyers who fought every aspect of the investigation. They argued that years of raising the children had created legitimate parental bonds that superseded any criminal circumstances of acquisition. They claimed the children would be traumatized by removal from the only families they had ever known. They threatened lawsuits against the county if any attempt was made to reunite the stolen children with their biological mothers. The legal arguments revealed a disturbing truth about how wealth could transform child theft into something defensible, how families with resources could hire attorneys to reframe crimes as complicated situations requiring nuanced consideration rather than simple justice. Through Beatrice's ledger and testimony from cooperating buyers, investigators located 14 stolen children by late April 1947. The youngest was 8 months old. The oldest was 11 years. And every one of them presented an impossible dilemma that exposed the cruelty of trying to correct crimes committed years earlier against people too young to remember their origins. Margaret Hensley's daughter, Emily, now 6 years old, had no memory of anyone except Ruth and Thomas Vance, the couple who had raised her in the coal mining hollows. When Margaret tried to approach the child during a supervised visit arranged by the court, Emily screamed and clung to Ruth, calling her mama and begging not to be taken by the stranger. Margaret, who had spent 6 years mourning a child she believed was dead, now faced the reality that her daughter viewed her as a threat rather than salvation. The Bellamy twins, now 2 years old, had been raised in comfort and security that their biological mother, a widow who had been told they died during delivery, could never have provided. The woman, living in a single room and working as a laundress to survive, wanted her daughters back desperately. But child welfare officials, who visited both homes, submitted reports that painted a devastating picture. The twins had a nursery decorated with hand-painted murals, shelves of toys, and a nanny who cared for them daily. Their biological mother had a cot in a boarding house and worked 12-hour days just to afford food. An 8-year-old boy named Daniel had been raised by a wealthy family in Ohio who genuinely believed they had adopted him legally through Beatrice's services. They had paid $1,900 in 1939, received what appeared to be legitimate documentation, and spent 8 years building a family. The boy attended private school, took piano lessons, and called his buyers mom and dad with complete sincerity. His biological mother, who had been 17 and unwed when Beatrice took him, was now 25 and married with 2 other children. She wanted her firstborn back. But Daniel refused to even speak to her, viewing the court ordered visits as punishment for crimes he did not understand. The court struggled with questions that had no good answers. Should children be forcibly returned to biological mothers they did not remember, potentially traumatizing them for the sake of legal justice? Could buyers who had raised stolen children for years be considered legitimate parents, despite the criminal origins of their families? How could anyone determine what served the children's best interests, when every option seemed to guarantee someone would suffer? Several biological mothers, after seeing their children settled in homes that provided stability and opportunity, made choices that destroyed them but might have saved the children. Ida Sutton withdrew her claim to her daughter after watching the girl thrive in a family that could give her everything poverty had denied. Helen Kowalski agreed to let her son remain with his buyers after doctors warned that forcing separation could cause psychological damage to a child who viewed his purchasers as his real parents. Dorothy Marsh fought for a year to reclaim her twins before finally accepting that the girls would never know her as anything but the woman who disrupted their lives. Other mothers refused to give up. Margaret Hensley pursued legal custody of Emily despite the child's resistance, believing that time and patience would eventually allow her daughter to understand the truth. The process took 18 months and required therapy for Emily, who experienced nightmares and behavioral problems as she was slowly transitioned from the only family she had known to a biological mother who felt like a stranger. by the time Emily finally accepted Margaret as her parent, the damage to everyone involved was immeasurable. And the question of whether justice had been served remained unanswered. Beatrice Lell's trial began in August 1947 in a courthouse packed with spectators, journalists, and families whose lives she had destroyed. Prosecutors charged her with 17 counts of kidnapping, fraud, child trafficking, and falsifying official documents. The evidence was overwhelming. The ledger documented years of systematic theft. Testimony from mothers revealed calculated manipulation. And confessions from complicit officials exposed the network that had enabled her crimes. But Beatrice's defense attorney attempted a strategy that revealed how deeply poverty and shame shaped perceptions of morality in Appalachia. He argued that Beatrice had not stolen children, but had rescued them from lives of deprivation and illegitimacy. He painted her as a pragmatic woman who understood that unwed mothers and destitute families could not provide adequate care, and that placing babies with wealthy families who desperately wanted them was a service rather than a crime. He presented letters from buyers describing loving homes and opportunities the biological mothers could never have offered. The argument divided public opinion in ways that were deeply uncomfortable. Some viewed Beatrice as a monster who had exploited vulnerable women for profit, turning human beings into commodities and destroying families for money. Others, particularly those from communities where hunger and deprivation were daily realities, saw a more complicated truth. They understood that some babies born into poverty really did face grim futures. That unwed mothers genuinely struggled to survive with illegitimate children, and that adoption, even coerced adoption, might sometimes be preferable to starvation. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge sentenced Beatrice to 25 years in prison, citing the systematic nature of her crimes, the vulnerability of her victims, and the irreparable harm she had caused to dozens of families. As guards led her from the courtroom, Beatrice showed no emotion. No remorse, no acknowledgement that she had done anything worthy of punishment. She served 9 years before dying of a heart attack in May 1956 at age 63. Her death brought no closure to the families she had shattered. Several biological mothers never learned what happened to their babies, as some entries in Beatrice's ledger were incomplete or coded in ways investigators could not decipher. Some buyers had fled to other states when the investigation became public, disappearing with stolen children whose biological families would spend lifetimes wondering if they were still alive. The children who were reunited with biological mothers carried scars that never fully healed. They grew up with fractured identities, caught between families, never quite belonging to either the mothers who gave them birth or the buyers who had raised them in their early years. Those who remained with purchasing families lived with the knowledge that their existence was built on theft, that their parents had committed crimes to obtain them, that somewhere biological mothers grieved for children who would never know them. The buyers who lost children they had raised for years carried their own devastating grief. Some had genuinely believed they were participating in legal adoptions and were as much victims of Beatrice's deception as the biological mothers. Others who had known exactly what they were purchasing lived with guilt that poisoned their remaining years. Beatrice took many secrets to her grave. The ledger did not account for all 32 infant deaths she had reported, leaving gaps that suggested additional thefts she had never recorded or had deliberately obscured. Some families would never know whether their babies had truly died or had been sold to strangers who raised them under different names in distant states. If this story revealed something dark about human nature and the price of desperation, make sure you like this video and subscribe, because tomorrow we're exposing another case where trust became a weapon and the vulnerable paid the ultimate price. What would you have done if you discovered your child was stolen at birth? Leave your thoughts below.